Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another lecture, and for this lecture we're going to discuss isolation and imperialism. Uh, but before we begin our lecture proper on isolation and imperialism, I would simply like to talk about, do a quick recap on our last lecture. In our last lecture, we wrapped up our analysis of the progressive era. Um, we talked about progressivism, how it's a very difficult topic to sort of pinpoint. We looked at the life and the career of Theodore Roosevelt, speaking on the ways in which he reinvigorated the presidency and how he sort of changed the mold and sort of deviated from the norm of his immediate predecessors by one taking a direct role in legislation and passing legislation, and how he also began to treat unions better. He began to he broke the pattern and began to intervene on the side of labor, trying to create a square deal for all parties involved. And we also looked at the legacy of the progressives, the good and the bad, sort of presenting everything out on the table when as far as the progressives were concerned. Um, from the good that was done with the progressive amendments, and then also the bad with the link between progressivism and scientific racism. And now, with that being said, let's dive right into our lecture for today. And let me begin by saying, in 1898, the United States went to war with Spain to ostensibly to liberate the Spanish colony of Cuba and help it form an independent republic. Now, the result of the war was the creation of an overseas American colonial empire formed largely out of the former Spanish colonies of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In addition to the annexation of Hawaii after the overthrow of its native monarchy. Um, Now, this is often labeled the Great Aberration in American history and presented as a deviation from the norm. Now, with the common view being held that the United States, having been founded during an anti-colonial revolt and anti-colonial war, opposed opposed imperialism throughout its history and sought to encourage anti-colonial Republican revolts wherever they went. Now, along with anti-colonial colonialism, the commonly held view is that the United States was isolationist and determined to not get involved in any of Europe frequent disputes or any of Europe or the world's affairs. Um, Let me just start by saying that the United States was never isolationist or anti-imperialist, but rather a highly aggressive and expansionist power, and was always involved with the activities of the rest of the world. Um, the view that the United States was anti-imperialist and isolationist is illustrative of the distortion of the fact that Washington never proposed isolation in his farewell address. Many people look back to Washington proposing isolation in his farewell address. They link it like that, but that's not what he did. As president, Washington actively sought to expand the republic. One can look at the treaty with Spain, where the United States was dealing from a position of strength and was able to gain large amounts of territory at the expense of Spanish claims. Um, has sort of evident that the United States was looking to expand, was trying to get more territory. Um, the colonies. Um, the colonies that formed the United States were formed in the 17th century by an expanding political and imperial power, and later rebelled against that imperial colonial overlord in the 18th century. Now, this did not mean that they objected to imperialism or territorial acquisition via expansion, but rather during the revolution there were multiple attempts to seize territory, most notably the failed invasion of Canada under Richard Montgomery in 1774, and of course Isaac Hopkins' capture of Nassau back in 1776. And of course, in 1783, the treaty to end the war with the United Kingdom, it wasn't the United Kingdom at the time. It was simply the Kingdom of Great Britain. Um, uh, that treaty, the Treaty of Paris, saw the United States acquire not just the territories of the rebellious colonies, but also all of well, not really all, but most of Great Britain's claims to the territories east of the Mississippi River, of course, with the exception of Canada. And the Mississippi River at this time was not viewed as the final boundary of the United States. The founding generation had no problem with acquiring territory and expanding the nation. Um, the formal empire, what they did have a problem with was the republic acquiring traditional colonies. So they opted instead to have the land that was acquired be gradually incorporated into the republic on equal political basis or equal political footing with the other states. This is the formal empire. This is the republic as we know it today. This is how Ohio became a state in a territory. This is why the people in Ohio had the same rights had the people in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a founding member of the republic. Pennsylvania had the same rights as Ohio, and Ohio had the same rights as Pennsylvania. This is how they sort of solved that problem. This is how they sort of sidestepped the sort of uneasiness or the opposition they had to colonies. They wanted representation, and they wanted to, and in doing this, they ensured that other members, other territories, other possessions of the United States would have representation, roughly equal representation. Representation really being driven and decided by population in the House, but equal population, equal representation in the Senate, but population-based representation in the House, in the House of Representatives. Now, the first has an organized territory for these incoming territories. First has an organized territory and then has a state. And once an area had enough white settlers, they would be admitted into the Union. This is all going back to the Northwest Ordinance. The pattern, as we have discussed in our lecture on the Republic in the 1780s, the Northwest Ordinances laid out the pattern under which the territories would be sort of shuffled through the territorial stages and prepared for admission into the Union. In the 1780s, those Northwest Ordinances would serve as the checklist for the Republic's expansion. And the expansion of the United States took place by both treaty and war. To recount from our past discussions, the Louisiana Purchase was acquired by treaty with France. Florida acquired by treaty in 1819 following Andrew Jackson's invasion. Texas by treaty following a rebellion by American immigrants against Mexican authorities. The Southwest was acquired by war with Mexico in the Mexican War. The Pacific Northwest by treaty with Great Britain. The Gadsden Purchase by treaty with Mexico. And of course the Great Plains with wars by the native peoples on the plains. None of this was viewed as colonial expansion or imperialism because of the equality and the rights afforded to the settlers in those territories by the United States government. The entire continent was really viewed as belonging to the Republic by divine right via manifest destiny. Others, like Native Americans, the Mexicans, and the Spanish, did not see it that way. They saw it as aggression, subversion, and outright imperialism. Native Americans still hold the views on those 3 points. It is important to note that there are other forms of imperialism or domination of one area over another, and of one people over another. And this is an interesting fact, because both before the Civil War, the southeastern United States, the slave states, categorized themselves as an economic colony of the Northeast, and so too did the Western populace after the Civil War. But also there were segments of the northern states, of the Great Lakes states, and also the northeastern New England states, who would categorize themselves as colonies of the slaveocracy, of the slave power. So again, this is harkening back to those differing perceptions during the build up to the United States Civil War. Now, the now the expansion across the continent can hardly be considered isolationist. There is no way to really view it as isolationist, nor can the Monroe Doctrine, which called for the closing off of the hemisphere from Europe, really be seen as isolationist or non-imperialist, because while the Monroe Doctrine called for the closing off of the hemisphere from European powers, it still left the door open to be for the United States to continued expansion. And the expansion of American commerce across the world was also not seen as isolationist. There was an isolationist policy. For example, Japan had an isolationist policy in which they did not want to be bothered by outside forces. That, of course, will be broken by the United States, who, at the same time, many would argue was isolationist, but they weren't really isolationists when they showed up in Japan's harbor with guns pointed there, saying trade with us or else. That's not really isolationist at all. And again, that wasn't viewed as isolationist because the isolationist policy was limited toward non-participation in Europe's numerous intermittent wars. The emphasis on commerce was sort of an American rationale, and an alternative, a rational alternative to war, but also served to lead the United States into conflict. For example, commerce really served as the main reason for the outbreak of hostilities in 1812 between the United Kingdom and Great Britain. And the decision to go to war with Britain was largely the result of violations of the United States rights on the seas. This, coupled with British support for Native Americans in the Old Northwest, was seen as a conscious attempt to hinder American expansion and American trade. We'll break here in our lectures, and we'll come back to finish off our discussion on isolation and imperialism. And as always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you think so far about our lectures on isolationism, and imperialism.